Well, I want to say welcome to everybody. If you're here in the room, if you're hanging out with us online, either here on Sunday or another day, catching up, we're just glad to be together, and we believe God has great things in store for this year, and we want to participate in those in any way that we can. We're going to do this in a way by looking at the life of a guy that followed God with his whole heart. His name was Daniel. In fact, if you have a Bible, I want to encourage you to go ahead and grab that and go to Daniel chapter 1. We're going to be there in just a few minutes. If you don't have a physical Bible, if you're hip and trendy and you have a phone, right, an iPhone or a lesser phone, either way, and you can go. Sorry to insult you. Just go to the App Store and search Bible. The first app that comes up is crazy helpful, very simple, totally free, nothing to do with us, but it will get a Bible in your hand anywhere you go. And you can go to Daniel chapter 1. We'll be there in a minute. This guy, Daniel, we'll find out as we talk here in a few minutes, was the guy whose world was totally turned upside down. One day in his home that he knew and loved, yes, there were challenges, but not long after that, he wakes up one day and he's like, what happened to the world that I knew? Does anybody feel like that this week? As you watch the events of this past week unfold, did anybody wake up on any given day and say, oh my gosh, it's worse than I thought? Or, holy cow, it's exactly what I thought? Or, this is where it was headed all along, but I can't believe I got here. Anybody having these emotions, or is it just me? Like, we're watching this like, am I watching a movie? Like, this can't be real. This isn't how this is happening, right? I think as we get started, there's just a moment where we should probably just pause for a minute and not skip over this past week. I just got to say, it's hard to stand in a place like this, because here's the truth, is that as you look around the room or as you scroll through the feed of everyone who's watching, everyone comes from a different perspective. Everyone comes from a different history. Everyone comes from a different political bent, preference, belief, conviction, right? All of us in different places in understanding or appreciation or interpretation of what God actually wants to happen or expects to happen in the world. It comes from all over the place. But as I look at the Jesus of the Bible, I just have to say I'm heartbroken that his name was on a flag where violence was perpetuated in anger. I don't see that in the Jesus of the Bible. And so I think no matter what, any of us who call on his name, anyone who bears his name or follows him, no matter what other beliefs we may hold, we have to grieve that Jesus' name was portrayed that way. You see, Jesus' calling, our highest calling as followers of Jesus, is not to be right. It is not to win, and it is not to be in control. Followers of Jesus, what is our highest calling as followers of Jesus? To love deeply, to love sacrificially, to love empathetically. And so I just think it's worth a moment of our time together as people pursuing Jesus, going after him, to just step back and reflect and invite God's help to love people deeply. Not just the people that we agree with, not just the people with opinions that we would prefer. Jesus said our love extends all the way to those who we would describe as an enemy. And so we show up relationally with people. I'm just praying like crazy that the people of God, for all that we might fear in what's happening, for all the concerns it might raise, for all the preference or grief or celebration or however you're viewing these sorts of events, that instead we would back up. The first thing that we would pursue to do is to love deeply those around us and to show up with a listening ear instead of a shouted opinion. That we would spend more time listening to what God has to say than other people's interpretation of current events, conspiracy theories, or anything else. But instead, we would invite God's voice to be the primary voice. And that we would invite his strength to show up in the lives of other people with a deep empathy. And so maybe we should just take a few minutes. I just think what we should do is take a minute and pray. We asked people to do this via social media this week, but we want to be people of our word. We want to be people who do, not just ask. And so we're going to take a minute. And I want to invite you to take a moment and ask God for the wisdom and strength to show up with deep love, empathy, listening, and compassion in the lives of people around you. Can we just start there? Let's all take a moment and invite God to do that. God, even as we approach you, I just want to acknowledge that you were long before and you'll be long after, that you're not worried, you're not concerned, that you are strong, that you are involved, you are active, you are present. And so, God, we just acknowledge that you are our Father in heaven and your name is hallowed. And God, we come asking that your kingdom, that your will would be done here as in heaven. And God, may that begin in us. God, would you call to mind the people around us that you want us to show up for, our neighbors, our family, friends, that we would show up with a listening ear, ready to empathize, even if their experience is vastly different, if their interpretation is vastly different than ours. God, would you call to mind any ways in which we showed up unhelpfully this week? And if there is anything you would have us do to make that right, to repair that, God, would you not let us escape that thought? And God, on behalf of all of us, I pray in line with Philippians 2 that you would give us the strength and wisdom to do, the desire and the power. The desire and the power to do what pleases you. It is so hard to know, God, and there are so many emotions and so many things, God, but we know that you're stronger than all that. And so I just pray that you'd help us. God, our city needs a people full of joy and peace, overflowing with hope by the power of your Spirit. Our world needs that, our friends need that, our neighbors need that, and God, we need that. And so may we show up that way in your name, the name we know from the life of Jesus. And so we're counting on you, and we're counting on your Spirit. It's in Jesus' name we pray, amen. Daniel, in a whole different way, showed up in a place where he looked around and said, I have no idea how I got here. Actually, the story goes a little bit like this, that God's people had been promised a land, they had been set up, Jerusalem was the center of this place, and for hundreds and hundreds of years, God said, I will be with you, I'll be among you, I'll show up and meet with you and your people in this temple, I'll lead you by my law, you will be my people, and the whole world will know who I am because of who you are. It was the people of Israel, it's described in the Old Testament of the Bible, the Jewish scriptures through the whole Old Testament. And one of these guys' name was Daniel. Now, Daniel came along way later than the beginning of this whole kingdom that God had set up to show the world who he was. And by the time Daniel comes on the scene, the people of God had stopped listening to God. Over and over and over, they chose control and power and their way instead of submission and trust in the God of the universe to lead them, to protect them, to guide them. Over and over, God sent these people called prophets to say, don't run away from me. I got you, I'll provide for you, I'll lead you, you're my people, let's rescue the world together. But they said, nah, let's do this thing my way, we're just gonna roll, we're gonna do our thing. And they dishonored God, and God said, I can't let you continue to do this. It's bad for you, it's bad for all that I want to be in the world. And if you keep doing it this way, if you keep going this way, I'm gonna allow you to be conquered by foreign people, and you'll be carried out of this land. You will not be allowed to practice all the things that bring life, all these things that I have desired for you along the way. And that's exactly what happens. By the time of Daniel, Jerusalem and all of this people of God were conquered by other kings. In Daniel chapter 1, you'll see this in verses 1, 2, and 3. In verse 1, it says, during the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who you can find in history, we can date all this stuff, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, wrecked it, leveled it. The very symbol of God's people and God's presence among them was leveled, and the people of Judah were carried out. It says the Lord gave Nebuchadnezzar, gave this king who didn't value the things of God. We could talk for days about this. I don't have time. I'm already going to talk for a long time today. I gotta go fast. But God gave him victory over the king of his own people, of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. He carries them off into Babylon. Verse 3, it says, the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's, God's people, the members of God's people's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Daniel was one of these guys. Daniel was one of these guys who was gathered up from the important people, the in crowd, the royal family who was not following God's ways, all of them, and they endured the consequence. Daniel's carried off into a foreign land, and he and some friends, we don't know how many, at least 3 others, show up in this land, and they are carried into captivity. And Nebuchadnezzar's goal was to indoctrinate them with everything that was not God's people and use all of their strengths, wisdom, capacity, all these things to further the purposes of Babylon. He woke up in a day and he's like, everything has changed. This is not what I signed up for. This is not what I expected. And in every way possible, this should have just been a survival circumstance where instead of expecting all the good of God, he should have expected just the worst of everything. How do I get by? What compromises must I make? How do I just get through this? He even had something of a timeline of how long this would last, and he could have just gotten by. But instead, Daniel does something that I think we can learn deeply from. He finds ways to partner with God in a way that lead to his thriving instead of just surviving. In the midst of COVID and political change and in terms of masks everywhere and social distancing and all the challenges that we find ourselves in the change of our nation, however you're interpreting and understanding that, it's easy for us to just step back and settle, to wait, to just try to survive, to just try to get by until things get back to normal, whatever that means, or it gets to the next season or circumstances realign. But that's not what Daniel did. Daniel said, I'm here today. And he also acknowledged this, that God was there that day. Daniel held this firm belief that becomes the foundation of everything that we will actually talk about, and everything that we actually believe as followers of Jesus. It's this: God is always, always, always up to something. Always. There's never a time God is not at work. There's never a time he falls asleep at the job. There's never a time his strength runs out. And what we have chosen to acknowledge and what we are experiencing as followers of Jesus, maybe you don't identify that way. Maybe you don't call yourself a Christian, but those of us who do, we know this: God is up to something and it is for our good. That he is so loving and so kind, so generous and so giving, that he will even tell us things we don't want to hear so that we find our way into the good he has in mind for us. That he will engage us and work, and even in ways that we will never see or understand around us, that God is up to something. Now, Daniel had every reason to believe that was no longer true, because the symbol of God's presence in their lives, the temple, was leveled. The people of God that God had promised, he said, I'm going to gather a people and the whole world's going to know you because of this people, were now shattered, separated, scattered everywhere, and he was one among the few men who would have survived, and only survived because he was going to be used. The practices of the way that we engaged God in the law that had been given were now no longer going to be an option because they lived in a land where none of those things were valued. He had every reason to believe that God had pieced out on his life, and maybe you do too. Maybe the last 8 months, maybe the way that you've understood how God works in the world have led you to believe that God is like, he's out. He's ticked, he's distant, good luck, let's just get by. Not true. God is always up to something. Even in the most tragic of things that Daniel was experiencing, God was up to something. In fact, you already saw it. In verse 2, God was at work even in the destruction of Jerusalem. God was involved, aware, and participating in what was happening, even in the leveling of his own city. Like, God was so at work, it said God gave this nation over to Nebuchadnezzar. If you read into Daniel chapter 1, I'll make some sense of this here in a little bit, but you'll see it at least 3 more times. Verse 9 says this. It says, God had given the chief of staff, this guy Ashpenaz that we already read about, he gave him respect and affection for Daniel. He knew Daniel was going into this really hard season, but he went ahead of him. into this guy, into the life of a guy named Ashpenaz, and says, I'm gonna give you favor, Daniel. I've already gone ahead of you. I know everything looks like a disaster, but I've gone first. I was there before you got there. I love that. He goes on in verse, I think 17, it says, God gave these 4 young men, Daniel, and you may know Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, right? If you've ever read through this story of Daniel. Their real names were Azariah, Mishael, and Hananiah. The God-given names, the meanings of which I wish I had time to go into. So rich, so good. But God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude. God gave them what they needed to endure a really challenging and actually thrive in a really challenging circumstance. He gave them unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. He said, I will make you wise so you can navigate what's ahead. And then for Daniel, God gave Daniel this special ability to interpret dreams and meanings of visions and dreams. And so if you'll read into, I hope you will, I hope you'll take the app that you downloaded, the Bible that you brought, and read through the story of Daniel. You'll watch this unfold. How God, long before they got there, had things in mind for their time there. You see, for them, it must have looked like disaster. It must have looked like loss. It must have looked like the hardest thing they could ever endure, the thing they never wanted to happen, the thing that prophets have been saying, please turn your mind, turn your lives around so this doesn't happen. And it happened. And they found themselves a place they never wanted to be. But God was already there. And so just by way of reminder, as you step into 2021, even as we got this kind of gut punch on January 6th of, okay, maybe 2021 won't be better, let me just remind us, the perspective of people does not prevent the work of God. The way we see things is not the way things are. They're just how we see things. Our perspective is just our perspective. And God sees things on a whole other level. In fact, I gotta tell you this. One of the guys' names was Mishael, and I love what his name means. His name means, who is what God is? And I was like, boom. No one, that's the answer. No one is what God is. God sees things differently, sees things on a whole nother level, operates in a whole other way, can go ahead when we thought he was behind, can show up and prepare things that we thought were disaster, but he actually means for really, really good. God is so strong. I just want to remind you that God is at work. And the question for the next several weeks as we step into 2021, if God is at work, if we start with that assumption, if even the fact that you're listening to what he has to say in the book of Daniel, if you'll read through this, if we even are, just the fact that you're engaging him marks that he's at work. If we begin from that assumption that God is at work in each one of us, the question is, will we participate or will we ignore, rebel, busy ourselves, distance ourselves, get distracted, and miss out? Will we participate in what he is up to? You see, this is the brilliance of what Daniel did. Even in the most challenging of circumstance, he looked around and said, how do I participate in what God is up to? And this is what we as followers of Jesus want to do. It's why we say around here, we want to join Jesus. He's at work. How do we participate in what he is up to? Because what he does always leads to life and life more full, to actual thriving, not just surviving or getting by. The season may be challenging, but we can ask, even in a season like this, how do we join in what God is up to? Daniel did this in at least 4 ways that we're going to talk about for the next 4 weeks. He did this. We'll talk next week about the rhythms that Daniel developed in his life to participate in what God, because we all need rhythms. He also had support from his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He didn't do this alone. That's crazy talk. You should never do this alone. We all need support. We'll talk about that. In the 3rd week, he had a vision. I love this. If you look across the scope of Daniel's life, epic legacy. He had a vision. Rhythm, support, and vision. In the 2 weeks after that, we're going to apply that to a certain aspect of life. I can't wait to get to it. But today we're going to start with one that Daniel embraced, that created space in his life for God to do something new and fresh. Even when everything was falling apart, Daniel chose to embrace limits. Every single one of us needs to embrace limits. In fact, why don't you just take a second? When you start to think about limits, when people start saying what you can or cannot do, when you come to the end of the resource or the end of the time and you wish you had more, what kind of fan of you are limits? If you were to rate your relationship with limits, like how much do you just love limits? You're like, yes, Please put limits on me. Please tell me I can only go this far and not that farther. Scale of 1 to 10, how much do you love limits? Tell the person next to you right now. Go. We all love limits. Limits are everyone's favorite, right? Right? We all love people telling us how far we can stand from one another, or how many people can be in a store, or what times things are going to be open. We love limits, right? Everybody's a fan of limits. It's so good. So I'm just glad to be able to talk today about something everybody's stoked about, right? Oh my goodness. But you know who knows the value of limits? Parents, you know the value of limits, don't you? We know the value of limits. Ever try to raise a child with absolutely no limits whatsoever placed on them? How good of a plan is that? Limits have value. Talk to any person who's navigating their recovery about the benefit of limits or the detriment of a lack of limits. Talk to anyone teaching someone to drive a car about the value. Limits have value. It was the very limiting thought of what would it take to put 1,000 songs in someone's pocket that drove innovation and creativity to a whole nother level. You see, limits are not bad. I know our initial reaction is to step back from limits, but limits actually create freedom. Limits actually create fresh thinking. Limits actually create space for new things to happen. Peace, joy, innovation, creativity, all kinds of good can come in the space of a limit, and especially when we invite God into that limiting process. This is what Daniel did. Now, Daniel was cast into a culture where he was not stoked to be, and where many of the things that he had done to invite God's work in his life would no longer be an option. Let me show you verses 4 and 5 in chapter 1. It says this. This guy, Ashpenaz, was told, select only strong, healthy, good-looking young men, he said. Make sure they are well-versed in every branch of learning and are gifted with knowledge and good judgment and are suited to serve in the royal palace. And then train these men. Training, by definition, is limitation and rhythm. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon, much of which would have been deeply opposed and deeply offensive to the things of God. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens, by the way, that would have been sacrificed and offered to gods who were not Daniel's God, who Daniel had been commanded specifically, do not participate in the worship of any other god. The very taking of this food, which he would be commanded to eat, would be a violation of all that he stood for. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens. They would be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service, pursuing objectives many times counter to the very things of God. There were all kinds of things along here. And how did Daniel react? Did he acquiesce? Did he compromise? Did he just say, well, this is what I got to do for survival? Absolutely not. There's no way, Daniel thought. The best I can figure out, Daniel says, listen, I will never get through this without my God, and so I will not begin by dishonoring God. And immediately, he set a limit. He drew a line in the sand, and he said, in my life, I will go this far and no farther. Now listen, limits will help you whether you follow Jesus or not. But God-honoring limits are the best kind of limits because they create space for God to do something fresh and new. This is the kind of limit that Daniel drew. He didn't do something he probably hadn't done for his whole life, but he did it in a more challenging, a brand new environment that could have cost him his very life. In verse 8, it says this, Daniel was determined. He placed his heart, is what that word means. He placed his heart. He drew a line in the sand with deep conviction. He was determined not to defile himself by eating food and wine given to him by the king. Again, because it was food and wine that was offered in worship to a God other than the one true God. He asked the chief of staff, Daniel, teenage, probably 18, 20-year-old Daniel, walks in to Ashpenaz, the chief of staff, and says, listen, I know you just conquered my land. I know you just carried me against my will out of my own land. I know you're about to train me for your land, but by the way, that king who rules all of this and tells everyone what to do and can take anyone's life at any moment, I don't want his food. He asked the chief of staff for permission not to eat these unacceptable foods. Bold move. He was determined that he would not limit the space God could work in his life, but would partner with God, even in the most challenging of circumstance. And I wonder if that's something that many of us need to do. I wonder if stepping into 2021 and the challenge of all that has happened, instead we might need to create a new limit, to step back from some things, to create some space for God to do something fresh and new. Daniel had options, all kinds of rich food, great wine, but he set a new limit. And new limits create new space for God to make something new in us and around us. If we'll step back from something, these rhythms that we stepped into, if we love our life exactly the way it is, keep everything the same. If there's anyone here who might want more in their life or think God can do fresh and new in your life, one of the best ways to engage that is to set a fresh limit and say, I'll go this far and no farther. In the things that I eat, I'll go this far and no farther. In the things that I drink, I'll go this far and no farther. In the way that I spend my money, I'll go this far and no farther. In the amount of sleep I get, I will go this far at least. In the hours that I work in a given week, I will go this far and no farther, because if I live like I'm limitless, my life will fall apart. Anybody relate to that? Just like raising a child with no limits is a terrible idea, us living without God-honoring limits is a bad plan. New limits give us new space for God to do new things in our lives. In fact, reflect for just a minute. Last week, we challenged everyone to look back over 2020, to look back and grab up all the good that God might teach us. And I wonder if, like me, you look back at the last year at times in your life where a limit would have helped you, but you didn't set it. Anybody have that? A time in your life financially where a limit really would have helped you. And I'm not talking about the credit card limit. By the time you get there, we're past some help. Or for me, early on in COVID, working 65 plus hours a week. Not helpful. A limit would have been helpful, right? In fact, think about this question. Maybe take a picture, reflect on this week. How have the lack of limits in my life, a lack of setting God-honoring limits in my life, the amount of time I scroll, the amount of news I read, the amount of opinions I pursue, the amount of approval that I need, the lack of sleep that I allow, the amount of food I consume. How have a lack of limits in my life actually limited the work of God in me? That God may be inviting you to do something, to change something, become something. You say, well, I can't because I don't have the time. I don't have the money. I don't have the energy. I don't have the capacity. The way we produce those things, the way God invites us to engage in all that is to set a God-honoring limit. God never asked us to be everything all the time. We are not limitless. Limits that God gave us are a gift. And we have a daily reminder. How many of you can go multiple weeks without any sleep? Anyone? Bad plan, right? We have limits on the given day and the energy that we have. We have a limit, a healthy balance of the things that we take into our body so that our body becomes our servant instead of our master. The ways that we get to participate in the limits that he has naturally given us. And when we try to behave limitless, when we try to cheat the system, when we try to go around the side, we end up in bad places. God-honoring limits are a gift. We naturally have these. Let's embrace these. In fact, here's the question we're going to wrestle with, hopefully this week that you'll wrestle with, is this. What new limit? Stepping into 2020, what new limit would create new space for God to make us new? Where in your life could you set a limit you've never set before? Like Daniel, that's challenging, that would create fresh space, and you would say, God, you put whatever you want in this space. Next week, we'll talk about rhythms to invite God's activity, and the week after that, the support of other people who can help us because it's hard. But this week, let's begin. God, what kind of limits might you want to set in our lives? If you look at the life of Daniel, what we find is that God-honoring limits always reflect God's character and his word. Daniel set a diet limit, but it was not about losing weight or being healthy. It was about honoring God, and the byproduct was being healthy, thriving, and ends up winning the affection of not only his leader, but the king. God-honoring limits always reflect God's character and his word. And so as you think about limits, if you want to invite God to help, to partner with God in what he has in mind in 2021, our limits must be God-honoring, not just self-protective or not just self-interested. They're in line with God's character and his word, like we should rest one day a week. Try that limit. Produce nothing on one whole day a week, 24-hour period. Or better yet, take your finances, if that's where pressure is really happening for you. God says, I can do more on 90% than you can do on 100. Try me. Set a limit on our spending. You know what? God says, I have so much to teach you and show you about my character, but this happening all the time is getting in the way. This is, just so you know, this is not in charge of you, you're in charge of it. And so you can go into like the settings and set limits on how much you can do. And so we set some new limits and create some space. They'll always point us in God's direction. God-honoring limits create fresh space for God to do new things. They'll always have a meaning bigger than us as well. Always, always, always. God-honoring limits mean something more than us. As much as these kind of limits and embracing God's activity in our lives will produce new and fresh things in each of our lives in 2021, they will also produce good and great things in the lives of others. And they will always point people toward Jesus. So if you're gonna set a fresh limit, the question is gonna be, who is this about besides me? What will this enable me to do in service of others? Right? Why would I want to lose weight and be healthy? Why would I want to get more sleep and be more present? Why would I want to limit the number of hours that I work at a particular place? Why is my conversation that's happening on social media, maybe how could it be more helpful if it was limited or more clear? Right? They'll always have a meaning because beyond this, it was about God, not just about Daniel. Daniel's limit, the line that he drew in the sand was, I'm not gonna defile myself by dishonoring God. You can carry me anywhere you want, but I will point people toward the one true God. And here's the thing, God-honoring limits, just so you know, they will require more than us. They will require more than just sheer willpower. This is not a New Year's resolution. This is a partnership between us and the all-powerful God of the universe who loves us and has more in mind for us and people around us. In fact, as Daniel made this request to this guy named Ashpenaz, Ashpenaz was like, if you don't eat the food that I gave you and you get weak and you don't train well, then all of a sudden my neck's on the line and Nebuchadnezzar's not just gonna kill you, he's gonna kill me. And so Ashpenaz gets afraid. He gets nervous. What if it doesn't work out? What if this doesn't go the way that you think? What if? And all of a sudden, very easily, both Daniel and Ashpenaz could have talked them out of this practice. And it just occurs to me that for each one of us, we have a voice inside of us that believes and desires better for us and also talks ourselves out and discourages us from doing it. The fear, the cost, the worry, maybe I'm the only one. But as soon as I aspire and dream, there's always a voice right on the heels of that says, maybe not. What if this, what if this? Fear, self-doubt, all kinds of things take over. Am I alone, or can anybody just give me a head nod that I'm not crazy? Okay, cool. So listen. You have a choice. You can be Daniel, draw a line in the sand and invite God's help. Or you can be afraid and be Ashpenaz. And I'm just here to say, don't be an Ashpenaz. When you're tempted to quit this week, when someone around you discourages you, just look him in the eye and say, don't be an Ashpenaz. Don't be a doubter. What he didn't know is the God of the universe is way stronger and will carry us through in the direction that he wants us to go. They will require more of us. We will have to invite the help and support of others. We'll talk about it in a couple weeks. But Daniel did. He did not relent. Look at verses 11 through 14. In verse 11, it says this, Daniel, he spoke with the attendant, and he had appointed as the chief of staff, this guy. And he went, the guy who was appointed to look after Daniel and his friends, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He said this, please test us. Put us to the test. I dare you. Put us to the test for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water. And at the end of 10 days, see how we look. Just see what happens. See if God doesn't come through. See if God doesn't know better than even the king of Babylon. And see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's foods. Then make your decision in light of what you see. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. What I love about Daniel is super practical. Let me give you 3 practical things. If you're gonna invite God into your life, this is rapid fire. Have your phone ready if you wanna take pictures to take notes. These are no-touch notes. You can just take it off the screen. Crop me out. If you wanna set great limits, define them really clearly. He said 10 days, vegetable and water. In fact, if you wanna create some great space for God, maybe you should try this. It's called the Daniel Fast. Lots of great tips, recipes, and all kinds of things online. Not just to lose weight and be healthy, but instead to invite God's work. He defined it very clearly. And then in setting limits, he also partnered with God and people. He looked around all the food options of Babylon and said, which of these honor God? I'll choose these. I'll invite God's help, and I'll invite the help of my friends Azariah, Mishael, and Hananiah. We will not live into the life God has in mind for us by ourselves. We will need to partner with God and his people. And so sure enough, at the end of 10 days, after they had done this, clear limits, partner with God and people, what we find is this in verse 14 and 15. At the end of 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of food and wine provided for the others. And Daniel and his friends continue to honor God in a land where they should have settled for survival. They thrive. So one more tip in setting limits, just straight from Daniel. Along the way, reflect and celebrate. Every step, every increased energy, every day where work was set aside without stress and anxiety, every time you observed some limits around food intake or anything else, every accomplishment of exercise that's an increase from before, or whatever else you're gonna do to step into what God has in mind for you this next week, the money that is saved by some limits set around, whatever limit you set, reflect. How did it go? What did God teach me? What you'll find is that in the space you create by a limit, you're gonna find some junk in you that drags you back into old habits. Every single one of us has it. It's why New Year's resolutions are lousy. Because once you set the limit, what it reveals is all the things that caused the habit. And we're gonna need God's help right there. And we're gonna need people's help right there. It'll be revealing, deeply revealing. And this is why lots of people don't set limits, because they're afraid of what they'll find. But I want you to know, God's not afraid. God is strong. He'll meet you there. And if you'll invite his help and surround yourself with people who will help, God can do something fresh and new. And so maybe you should just ask this question. I would encourage you to as you step into 2021. You want to thrive in a challenging season? Ask this question. God, what limit should I set? What limit should we set? The more you find yourself rebelling from the idea of limits, the more you might need to lean in. On the other side of some restraint and participation with God is a lot of the good that he has in mind for us. And so I want to invite you to take a minute to reflect on this question. God, what new limit would create fresh space for you to do something new? Take a minute and think, for real. Don't just listen about a story about Daniel. Daniel modeled a way. God invites us in to work with him. He's always at work. The question is, would you embrace a God-given way to create some new space? What kind of limit might God be inviting you to? Is it a physical limit? Maybe it is. New year. A lot of people are thinking about it, lots of resources out there. Maybe it is, but not just for your own health, for God to have space. Maybe it's a physical limit, like a Daniel fast, or something else that matches your health condition that a doctor would say is wise for you and healthy for you. Maybe it's around alcohol or some other substance that at times, in moderation is fine, but it's pressing the edge of that. Maybe it's something different, like sleep. Maybe you need a minimum limit on sleep, where you've been trying to press the edges without limits and find yourself cranky and depleted without energy. Maybe it's not physical, maybe it's financial. Maybe you need some different financial limits to step in, and just test it for 10 days. It doesn't have to be forever. Test it for 10 days and see what God reveals, see what he shows you, see what might happen. Maybe it's a media limit. We've referenced it several times. Are you sure that all the scrolling is actually making your life better? Are we sure that the posting that we're doing, maybe a limit just for a time, would reveal something fresh and new that God has in mind for us, something we wouldn't have realized without the limit? God, what new limit would create fresh space? With Daniel and his friends, because of a limit that they observed, and this young man who set a limit honestly set a course for his whole life, a career that would be 60 years long, that would begin after a 10-day bold risk of his life move that would follow through the training of 3 years, that the moment he steps before Nebuchadnezzar, it says, no one impressed the king like these 4 young men. And they were found to be 10 times more capable than any of the other young men who were brought before the king. You see, God honors God-honoring limits. He does. He creates a different kind of fruit in us than can create it any other way. God honors God-honoring limits in our lives. In fact, this guy drew a line in the sand that would set the course, like I said, for 60 years. Can't wait to talk about it in 3 weeks, about the vision that was out in front of him. It's because he began young and said from the moment he was carried into captivity, he would not compromise, he would not give in, he would not settle. Survival was not the standard, thriving only, and God's participation in it. And what unfolds, if you'll read it through the book of Daniel, is an epic partnership between this guy, Daniel, and the God who spoke him into existence, and he thrived. And I think that God has the same thing in mind for you. And so especially those who are young, reckless, crazy, who will set some bold limits and draw some lines in the sand. If you do that now, it will bear a fruit over the course of your life that cannot be measured. If you invite God's work in space right now, in fresh and new ways, every time you draw that limit. Now, some of you are like, I am not that young. You are younger right now than you will ever be for the rest of your life. Someone once said the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago or today. So today, invite God to make some limits. Have a great conversation with God. Have a great conversation with some people around you and draw a new line. You know why? Because Jesus drew limits. You want to bear his name? We want to bear his name. We want to follow Jesus. No one limited themselves like Jesus, who set heaven aside to enter creation, and within creation to come as a baby, to raise to 30 years of life, to lead, to limit all of the ways he could have invested and changed everything, but he set in course a movement that would last for 2,000 years. And then, of course, to limit himself to death. The creator of the universe, who thought of life, limited himself to death, even death on a cross. And why did he do that? Because he said, I only do what my Father tells me to do. Because on the other side of this limit was all the good that God had in mind for every single one of us. And so we embrace limits. The one whose name we bear embraced limits. And because he did, like Daniel, God elevated him to the highest place, a name that is above every other name. And so I want to encourage you, take just a moment or two and reflect on the one whom we follow, who set limits in his life for the behalf of God and others. Would we follow in his steps? And in January of 2021, what is the next limit God would invite us to follow him into? May God give you boldness, strength, clarity in his spirit, and some great people around you to create some fresh space for God to do something new in your life for the benefit of you, those you love, and everyone around you. In Jesus' name.